All right, so today I'm going to talk about John Adams, the second President of the United States. So, at the end of Washington's presidency, our first political parties were starting to emerge. You'll probably remember that Washington discouraged the formation of political parties, but there really wasn't a whole lot he could do to stop that. Even within his own cabinet, divisions had started to emerge, and they were starting to people are starting to have different economic priorities, different diplomatic priorities, and so on. So in the election of 1796, you have the first two political parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. And these two parties were mostly like North versus South type of regional alignment. And because the North and South had different economies, there were a lot of differences in the two parties' approach to the economy. But there also emerged other differences, like with diplomacy and stuff, as we'll see later on. So the Federalists were mostly from northern states, and they were led by Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and John Jay. And the Democratic Republicans were from the South, and they were led by Jefferson, Madison, and Albert Gallatin. And in the first presidential election after Washington, that was 1796, you have Adams taking first place in that election and Jefferson taking second place in that election. And according to the rules at the time, that meant that Adams would become the president and Jefferson would become the vice president. So even though they were from different political parties, they were supposed to be working together at that point. You can imagine that wasn't the best arrangement. One of the first things that Adams wanted to do was try to smooth over diplomatic relations with France. And France had gotten its feathers ruffled because, of course, it had given us all this help during the American Revolution. But then when it went to war with Britain in the 1790s, Washington really wanted the U.S. to remain neutral in that whole conflict and not take a side. And that caused some issues between France and the U.S. So John Adams sent some diplomats over to Paris to try to smooth things over. And this political cartoon shows what comes to be known as the XYZ affair. The multi-headed gentleman in the center is representing the French agents who approached the American diplomats who were on the left. And he basically said that if they wanted to meet with Talleyrand, who was the foreign minister of France, they would have to first pay a personal bribe to Talleyrand of $250,000, which was a whole bunch of money back then, and also guarantee a loan to France of $12 million. So that was the price that they were going to have to pay if they wanted to just meet with Talleyrand. And of course, the American diplomats were a little bit shocked by that treatment from France. And one of them, Charles Pinckney, was famously known to have said, "No, no, not even a sixpence would they give the French." So Pinckney and his fellow diplomats returned to the United States, where they reported what happened to President Adams. As offended as President Adams was, he wasn't really interested in pursuing war with France over this matter. However, other Federalists, members of Adams' party, were definitely war hungry. They felt that what France had been asking through Talleyrand was totally insulting to the U.S., and so they were really clamoring for war. Democratic Republicans, however, remained sympathetic to France. You might remember that Thomas Jefferson was an ambassador to France for several years, and he was one of the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party. So they and the Federalists sort of clashed on that issue of where they should go with this whole thing with France. Adams, in an attempt to silence some of his critics, took some measures that were not really in keeping with what had been written in the Constitution, in particular the First Amendment, which you know that everyone likes a lot. So Congress, which was controlled by the Federalists, passed 4 laws that were sort of designed to keep people from criticizing them. Those laws were the Naturalization Act, which basically made it so that you could not become a citizen of the U.S. after 5 years of residence, and instead made that 14 years of residence before you could become a citizen. Then there was the Alien Act, which allowed the president to deport any resident alien who was considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. That one only lasted for 2 years. It did come with an expiration date. Then there was the Alien Enemies Act, which allowed a president to arrest and deport resident aliens if their home countries were at war with the U.S. And this one actually is still in effect, believe it or not. And then there's the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writings against the government or certain officials. As you can imagine, this one especially was ticking people off because it totally violates the protection of free speech in the First Amendment. Lots of people were up in arms over these acts, and two gentlemen, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who, as you know, were Democratic Republicans, decided to write resolutions on behalf of a couple of the states protesting this outrage. Now, Jefferson had to do his confidentially or anonymously because, of course, he was the vice president at the time, and to write something against the president would have been in bad form. So he wrote his on behalf of the state of Kentucky. Madison wrote the Virginia resolution, and again, these two resolutions basically said that the federal government was overstepping its powers. Now, these didn't have any binding legal ramifications, but by standing up for states' rights, these resolutions did actually have an impact on later decades of U.S. history where states' rights versus federal rights continued to be an issue. So that, in a nutshell, is a little bit about John Adams' presidency. Now you can enjoy this short video from the Disney Channel.
When John Adams became president, it marked the first peaceful transition of power the United States and modern democracy had ever known. And that's ironic, because Adams was known as a hothead and kind of obnoxious, which made him just the guy to butt heads with France. France and England were at war, and American ships traveling to Europe were being attacked by the French. People in the United States were demanding a war, and the always argumentative Adams wouldn't give them one. He was the first president who faced the immediate threat of war and fought back with diplomacy. Unfortunately, his decision to resort to tough talk rather than tough actions made him unpopular with a lot of people in his own party. Still, history has been kind to our second president's actions during the crisis.
Stop and think if Adams had gone to war with France. First of all, there never would have been a Louisiana Purchase. The United States of America might very well end at the Appalachians.
Hear that? Had we gone to war, some cowboys in Texas might be wearing 10-gallon berets.
Sacre bleu, partner!
History has been a little less than kind to the Alien and Sedition Acts signed by Adams during the French crisis.
John Adams was a brilliant man, but he could be hard-headed and blustery and just stubborn. And the Alien and Sedition Acts were 4 laws that essentially prevented people from criticizing the government. Well, the big problem with that is it's in violation of the First Amendment, of freedom of the press. And if you're gonna violate an amendment, don't violate the First Amendment. I mean, it's just so obviously wrong.
The acts were very unpopular with Adams' old friend Thomas Jefferson, who ran against him and helped our second president become our first one-term president. The two had feuded for a while. Adams was a Federalist who wanted a strong central government, while Jefferson insisted that power be held by the states. To simplify, Adams might have argued that only the federal government was strong enough to keep all the states in line. And Jefferson might have argued that what happens in Virginia stays in Virginia. He thought a too strong government might put America right back where it started. Adams, the first president to live in the White House, left after about 3 months, but not before writing these famous words about the building.
May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
Whatever else may have been said about him, the words honest and wise certainly did apply to John Adams.